All right, let's talk about dragons in the Cosmere. Now, dragons have been mostly in the background of the various books, but in Isles of the Emberdark, which is the latest of Brandon's secret projects, they kind of burst to the forefront through two characters, that's Starling and Frost. And we learn so much about dragons, so I want to break all of that down in this video, which will include spoilers for Isles of the Emberdark, all of the Stormlight Archive, and then Tress of the Emerald Sea as well. Okay, so dragons in the Cosmere aren't quite what you may think of traditionally when you think about dragons, like these big beasts sitting on hordes of gold in a cave. In fact, they are seemingly the founders, or at least like the keepers of civilization across the Cosmere itself, and they're treated often as forms of divinity. By my count, there's only 5 up to maybe 7, but 5 to 7 dragons that we've met in the Cosmere to date. Those are Cultivation, famously, who is held by a dragon known as Corvellium. There's Zyzus, who's a dragon we see in Tress of the Emerald Sea. There's Starling and Frost that we meet in Isles of the Emberdark, but are referred to in the Stormlight Archive as well. And then there's references to the Vessel of Valor, who is also a dragon known as Medalantorius. And then potentially the holder of the Vessel of Reason, the Shard Reason, is also a dragon, but that we know basically nothing about. And so I'm going to reference each of these dragons through the course of this video. But at the end, I want to do a deeper look specifically at Frost and Valor, because I think they're two of the most interesting dragons out there. Okay, so first, dragons have 2 forms. They have a humanoid or human form, and then they have that draconic form. And it seems like they use both interchangeably. In Isles of the Emberdark, Starling explains that dragons mate and give birth in their human form, and their children grow as human for the first 30 years of their life, at which point they enter the age of transformation, where they can transform into their draconic form. And that was, she explains, Frost explains, that was Adonalsium's wisdom in order for dragons to experience what it's like to be human or to be mortal. Dragons are special. They wield some of the most potent or highest investiture levels of anyone in the Cosmere. In fact, they're so highly invested that they live a really long time. And so many of the ones that we meet have been around since before the shattering of Adonalsium. That's like 10,000 years before all of the events that we see are playing out. And at times, they are as old as the Ethers, which I think are like basically the oldest kind of things around in the Cosmere. So what that means is that dragons, their origins lie in the time of Adonalsium, when Adonalsium was still constituted, and they have this like crazy high levels of investiture. They're so highly invested because they have a special connection to the spiritual realm, where they can subsist essentially directly on energy or investiture drawn from the spiritual realm. What that means is that they don't need to eat, for example. They don't really need to sleep either. When they sleep, they go to what are known as the spirit shores, where they can kind of like it's like this meditative slumber where they can like commune with their ancestors. And the spirit shores is also where they go when they die. And because they're so highly invested, unlike humans where it takes like only a couple of seconds where you're kind of pulled into the beyond after you die, for dragons, that process takes millennia. And so we see them go to the spirit shores when they sleep, and we see them go to the spirit shores when they die as well. They're not immortal. I think they're often described as immortal. In Isles of the Emberdark, they're often described as immortal, but they're not. They live a really long time because of this level of investiture that I just talked about, but they can be killed primarily by negative investiture. In Isles of the Emberdark, we learn of at least 3 dragons that have been killed by threnodite entities of negative investiture, and by the fact that we see kind of their souls in the spirit shores, there have been many other dragons that have passed away as well. It's just really hard to kill them. Linked to how old they are, they also have this depth of civilization in the Cosmere that I think generally has centered around the planet of Yolen. Yolen is famous for being the location where Adnalsium was shattered, for example. And it's where Wit is from. It's for where many of the shards, I think maybe all of the shard holders are, because that's where they shattered Adnalsium. In Starling's words, Yolen is a special planet that was the source of nearly all life in the Cosmere and the origin of the shards, because that's where Adnalsium is shattered. And there's at least 3 dragons involved in the shattering of Adnalsium on Yolen. That's Frost, who didn't take up a shard, and who I'll talk more about later. That's Cultivation of Corvallium Avast, who did take up the shard of Cultivation. And then that's Medalentorius, who did take up the shard of Valor as well. As I mentioned, I think the shard of Reason may also be held by a dragon. So there may be 4, but there's at least 3. And there's kind of 2 characteristics around their time on Yolen. One is it seems like they were treated as essentially divinities during that time. Cultivation, for example, she was a dragon, but she was quote unquote trained as a god. And we see Frost on Yolen taking prayers, for example. So they're treated as divinity. But the second part of that is this depth of civilization that was centered around building civilizations, building palaces. In Isles of the Emberdark, Starling explains that over 10,000 years ago, if not even before then, they were involved in building the grand city of what's known as Larkal, which we basically know nothing about. But they were also involved in building, it seems like they were also involved in building the city of Silverlight, which is in the cognitive realm. It's like this kind of like trading hub in the cognitive realm, where a lot of different types of people subsist and live in. Starling explains that dragons spent years building up Silverlight, and today, and when I say today, I mean in the time of Isles of the Emberdark, Silverlight is protected by the authority and the power of the dragons themselves. The planet of Yolen, where dragons, I think, center around, and the city of Silverlight that they were involved in building also have their own special connection. They are connected through the Silverlight nexus, that's the perpendicularity that connects those 2 places that most people didn't know about until recently. At some point in history, and I'm not sure if this was before or presumably maybe after the shattering of Adnalsium, dragons were also involved in a rivalry between the Fane and the Unfane. And I'm not quite sure exactly what the Fane and the Unfane are referring to. My general sense is that the Fane are the dragons, and then the Unfane are mortal species like the humans. But as a result of this rivalry, Starling explains that dragons officially withdrew from political life. And they did so because they learned or realized that their involvement was causing others to stagnate or, at worst, bleed. And I think that's why we see dragons like Frost and Cultivation are basically adhere to this kind of spirit of non-interference for the most part. And the only times that we see them engage in the events of the Cosmere are in like very subtle or very minimal ways. Unofficially, it's not quite that simple, because despite the fact that they have officially retreated from political life, we have seen some dragons, Xyzus is a good one, in becoming like these big time like business magnates essentially, rather than political figures. And so they are running these, at least Xyzus, running these kind of vast trading routes and empires almost, even though dragons have officially retreated. We don't know a lot about kind of the hierarchy and the structure of dragonkind now. In Isles of the Emberdark, we learn relatively little. We do know that there are some other like powerful dragons that are involved in disputing some form of justice to other dragons. That's what gets Starling her manacles, for example. But there's very little that we know about what that kind of looks like or where that's centered around. There's 2 dragons that I want to do like a little bit of a deeper dive into because I find them so freaking interesting. Those are Frost, who, as I mentioned, was involved in the shattering of Adnalsium, but he didn't take up a shard himself. And then Medalentorius, who is or was the vessel for the Shard Valor. So Frost is the recipient and then the responder of letters from Hoid in all the way back in Way of Kings, where Hoid is basically begging him for assistance, and Frost is the one that responds, kind of reiterating his pledge of non-interference. And with what we know about this backstory of kind of where dragons have retreated from political life, I do think there's reason behind that. But I do think Frost is really interesting because I think he's more involved in the Cosmere than what appears at first glance. In those letters, Hoid refers to individuals in the 17th Shard as some of Frost's friends. And the 17th Shard is this like kind of mysterious organization that we really don't know a lot about. What we do see them do is like chase after Wit or Hoid wherever they can find him. But it does seem like they have some of their own purposes. And I think Hoid's reference to the 17 Shards suggests that in the context of Frost, suggests that Frost is involved in leading or at least partnering with the 17th Shard for some sort of his own purpose. And I don't know what that is, but the 17th Shard could be a good giveaway, which is like potentially like involved in finding or creating or reconstituting a 17th Shard, another Shard that we know nothing about. At the time of Isles of the Emberdark, Frost is also missing. He's like stepped down from his throne seemingly and has like just like gone off on his side quest, and Hoid doesn't seem too bothered about it, which makes me feel like we shouldn't be too bothered about it. It could suggest that he's like formally stepped down or stepped away from this idea of non-interference and is starting to like actively interfere in the Cosmere, potentially in the context of the 17th Shard or something completely different. Metallentorius is another dragon that we know basically nothing about and that I think could be doing a whole lot behind the scenes. And that is the dragon that is or was holding the Vessel of Valor. What we know about her is that she was a quote-unquote a great dragon god, and she was a warrior. And we know she's been missing for at least 7,000 years because Honor tries to find her and fails. But he speculates that the vessel isn't actually dead because he would have felt those kind of ripples in the Cosmere as a holder of one of the shards himself. Metallentorius is really interesting because she also appears to have had some sort of relationship with Hoid. Endowment, for example, in her letters to Hoid basically begs Hoid or Wit to leave Valor alone. And at the end of Wind and Truth, regardless, he pledges that he needs to find her because she's the person that can actually help him in a serious way in this kind of battle for the Cosmere. I also know there's some speculation that she was Wit's or Hoid's wife in the past, or like some sort of romantic relationship. And we see a tiny note in Isles of the Emberdark that Hoid did have a wife, so it could be her. And so there's clearly like something going on there that I can't wait to learn more about. What I do think is clear is that there's some sort of kind of broad play that she's playing out that I think like could be combined with whatever Frost is trying to do as well. So some of the dragons at least might be making some like big play for the Cosmere. So that's kind of what we know about dragons. As I said, they've been mostly hidden in the background in keeping with their decision to withdraw. But they're poised, I think, at this point to like really burst out onto the scene in a really serious way. And so, I don't know what that means for the Shards or for the Cosmere, but they are some powerful beings that can like really reshape a lot of what's going on. And I can't wait to see what that is. So would love to know your thoughts in the comments below. But I hope this video was helpful in at least giving a baseline about dragons. And if you like this kind of content, please hit like and please subscribe to All Things Cosmere. Thanks everyone.